If you're struggling to get your drums to cut through the mix, let's talk about blending samples to get that punch. So I'm going to show you guys how I blended some kick samples and some snare samples, and the overall strategy as to how I would pick a kick or snare sample. It all comes down to just reinforcement, not total replacement. Sometimes in metal, you do need to replace the entirety of your snare and kick drum. The drummer just isn't cutting it, and you do have to do that, and I've done that on many occasions. But in this case, the drummer was very decent, and I just decided I wanted to reinforce his performance versus complete replacement. By the way, guys, there is no shame in using samples. Anyone that tells you otherwise is full of shit. I'm going to just come out right and say it. They're full of shit. Don't let someone bring you down for trying to get the job done. If everyone was the drummer from Nile, or if everyone was Nick Barker from Demo Borg Gear, you know, the world wouldn't have problems. But here's the thing, even those drummers at times do get sample replaced. So even the best drummers in the world nowadays, they're going to get sample reinforced. There's no ways around it. So don't let anyone tell you otherwise that samples is a bad thing. With that said, let's go ahead and check out the kick first, and let me show you how I pick the samples for that. Here's the kick without any samples whatsoever. It's a pretty natural sounding kick. You know, I don't have very much going on there. It's just a gate, my channel strip, and some EQ. However, if I was to play this in the context of the mix, you'll notice that the kick is lacking somewhat, and it's not entirely where we need it to be to have it come through the mix. So it's definitely audible, but again, it's lacking a bit of punch and body. And honestly, for my liking, I did want a little bit more high end as well. So first rules of picking samples. Decide with the end in mind. You're going to have to realize what you need first before looking into a sample. Don't just decide to arbitrarily pick up a sample and then just go with it. You have to actually decide, okay, you know, my kick drum is missing low end, so let me find a sample that is going to allow me to get more low end. You know what, my kick drum is missing high end, let me get a sample that's going to allow me to get some high end. In my case, it was a bit of both, so I picked a sample that had a bit of low end and as well as a bit of high end, and then I went ahead and blended that to taste. So I have my trigger plugin here, and as you can see, I have 3 different samples. And they are all slightly different. One of them is actually just a room sample. And the reason I chose a room sample is because I wanted to bring in a bit of realism to the samples that I have chosen, because they are pretty direct and dry sounding. So that is a bit, you know, fake sounding, but that room sample is blended ever so slightly just to provide that extra layer of realism. And I blended those to taste, and then I brought down the fader, and I settled on a final volume of about 9 decibels below the original kick drum. So let me go ahead and solo the kick, and let's go ahead and check out a few sections with and without that sample. Okay, that was the natural kick. Let's go ahead and add the sample. Now, it's adding a ton of consistency. It's not just a one-shot sample. There is some dynamic variability playing into this, and I decided, since it was not a metal track, that I needed to preserve as much of those dynamics as I possibly could, while still being able to reinforce the original performance. Ultimately, it is the same story with the snare. So the same concept applies to any time that I am replacing or reinforcing using samples. I decide what is lacking in the particular body of the drum, and I decide on a sample that is going to allow me to achieve what is missing. So in this case, I felt that the snare was, for a lack of a better word, subpar. It wasn't recorded very well. There was a lot of stuff missing, but I did my best to try to get as much as I could out of the original snare. And let's go ahead and listen to that now. So that is the snare sound I got with a gate and a channel strip and a bit of saturation to bring it to life. I didn't want to push it any further because I felt that if I did, that I would start getting into a territory that would kind of sound a little bit off and a little over processed. So that's when I decided to pull out my trusty trigger plugin and decided on a few samples. Now I blended the samples together in this fashion, and then I brought down the fader on the sample track and then blended that in with the real drums. Now the reason I chose these two samples was because this one has a bit of ring versus the natural drum. The natural snare drum doesn't have much ring to it, so I wanted to inject a bit of ring to the snare because I felt like that kind of ring would give it a bit more realism. And then of course I decided to go on basically a one-shot sample for the second sample. That is mostly just to add body to the snare drum. And there's a ton of high end as well on that as well, but it's mostly there to add a bit of 200 hertz and increase the body of the drum. So ring, body. All right. So we're going to go ahead and re-solo that snare, and I'm going to mute and unmute the sample. Now I will admit it is a bit of a drastic difference, but in the mix, it just sounds like the snare is getting slightly louder. So yeah, I mean, it's ultimately gonna change the character of the snare a little bit, but in the context of the mix, your brain is not gonna perceive it as such a drastic change. What it's actually gonna sound like is the snare is just, again, slightly louder. And here is the mix with no snare sample. And then let's go ahead and pop that in, and you guys will hear that the snare does have a bit more character in the mix. I really hope you guys were able to hear that. Again, in the context of the mix, the character of the snare didn't really change, but it did sound like it was being played a lot better and a lot more consistent when the sample was in there. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. The key takeaways here are enhancing the natural characteristics of the snare drum while filling in the missing pieces of the natural snare drum that you may feel that is lacking, such as body or high end. And then my final tip for you guys would be to pick 3 or 4 samples that are your go-tos. Don't have tons of sample libraries. Unfortunately, that was a mistake I did in my younger days, where I would constantly be buying different drum libraries to have, and that allowed me to get basically choice paralysis, where I can never really settle on a set of snare drums or kick drums, etc. So ultimately I stripped everything down, and I only settled on maybe 4 or 5 samples that I consistently use across every mix, across every genre. And they don't change, and if they do, it's very rare that I add anything, and that has allowed me to be able to learn those samples very well and be able to have a arsenal of samples that I can quickly pick from for a specific issue. Do I need more body? Boom, pull out that sample. Do I need more high end? Boom, I'm going to pull out that sample. So if you found this video helpful, give me a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.